What surprised me about this was Algeria. I don't, in the countries that come to mind as human rights violations, scary places to live, scary places to be a journalist, Algeria never was on my radar. Is that it may just be my abysmal ignorance, but is it? Do you think surprising to people that Algeria has this problem?
Well, I think when you compare Algeria from the early 90s, when there was considerable optimism as far as freedom and democracy goes, the government took very concrete steps to liberalize the press, to create a multi-party system. Of course, the civil conflict of the early 90s reversed all that, and the country was plummeted into bloody conflict for most of the decade, and which we saw nearly 60 journalists were murdered by armed groups. So it's been a very the Algerian press has seen quite a bit since the early 90s, this optimism, and then the turn to civil war, which took a very bloody toll on the press. And now we're sort of in the post-conflict era, in which the government is now trying to pressure journalists and reverse some of those gains. So I think there is a struggle going on by Algerian journalists to maintain their independence, this independence that they became very well known for in the 90s. Were a model for a developing free press in the region. Now they've been faced with this pushback by the government and are trying to face up to the challenge. And we've seen journalists going to jail, facing prosecutions, a government that seems intent on silencing some of the critical voices in the Algerian media. So the coming months will be a good test to see which direction the press will go. Will it continue to suffer under government pressures and repression and the jailing of journalists, or will the government come to realize that in terms of Algeria's international reputation as a country that says it is committed to democracy, that throwing journalists in jail for their work is not acceptable, and you can't have that in a democracy. And I think it's, Americans may ask, why should we be concerned about a place like Algeria? Well, if you look recently, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld just a few months ago made a tour of North African nations, Tunisia, and among them Algeria, where the discussions focused on cooperation in the war on terror. And Algeria has been an emerging ally of the U.S. government in the war on terror. And if it's pause for reflection whether the U.S. Is it good for the U.S. to ally itself with governments who throw journalists in jail or throw them before the courts and threaten them with imprisonment and other sanctions? So I think this is very relevant to America today.
Do you think something like an award like this has an effect there, as opposed to just a merited symbol here? But can it help these people?
I think it's important. I think journalists in places as far away as Algeria or other parts of the world that aren't very well known, it is a really powerful shot in the arm. And journalists will tell you that when their colleagues internationally are standing by them in solidarity, it gives a tremendous amount of moral support. In terms of effects, I think it does work when international pressure is applied in a consistent way. Governments do realize that it's not worth their reputation, the cost of throwing a journalist in jail or repressing the press, or in some countries killing journalists. It's not worth the cost of their reputations internationally. And I think pressure does work, and it's important that we all, as journalists, as colleagues, as supporters of freedom of expression, raise our voices in support of our colleagues, such as Mohammad Benchicou, who desperately need our support. And I think in the case of Mohammad Benchicou, I really think the Algerian government has gotten a free pass. And I think that's partly why he remains in jail today, that not many people have paid attention to his plight and the fact that he is in jail. But I do believe that if people can shine the light on the abuse of or the abuses against journalists so flagrantly as we've seen in Algeria, that hopefully the government will have a change of heart.
Can you talk to me a little bit about Egypt? Is Egypt one under your bailiwick as well?
Yes.
Because there's another award that's the Freedom to Publish Award, the Egyptian from Merit Publishing. Tell me a little bit about, I thought about Egypt as a reasonably modern country, reasonably progressive. I was sort of shocked to see that someone would need to be recognized for being brave and publishing in the face of the government.
Yeah, I mean, Egypt is a country where it's still a crime to Egypt is a country where defamation is a criminal offense. The government uses other laws, vaguely worded laws that it uses to punish the free expression of ideas, oftentimes ideas that are critical of the government. There's emergency law that's still in place, an arsenal of other related laws that the government uses to prosecute critics, including those in the press. Currently, Egyptian journalists are becoming increasingly vocal against the use of imprisonment against journalists for what they write. And that's something that's gained momentum because of the work of Egyptian journalists, local NGOs, and international NGOs who've campaigned on this issue. And Egypt's an interesting case. It is, I think, a place where in the last few years, journalists have become increasingly outspoken in the opposition and independent press. Some of them openly questioning President Mubarak and the logic of him continuing to be president, talking about political reform, criticism of the possibility that President Mubarak will have his son Gamal succeed him as president. Again, these are all topics that just a few years ago were completely off the table and something journalists wouldn't touch. So there is an emboldened press. It's taking more risks. It's trying to criticize the centers of power, and I think that's all positive. At the same time, when journalists do test the limits, governments tend to react oftentimes in a nasty way, and we've had journalists who've been abducted by unknown assailants, threatened for writing about important people in the government. We've had journalists who've been tried by Egyptian courts for defaming government officials when they reported on corruption and sentenced to prison, these journalists were. So there is a pushback. I think we've seen it not only in the Middle East and places like Egypt, but all over the world, that when journalists are trying to push the limits of what they can write, governments often react in a very repressive way.
This particular publisher, one of the things I thought was fascinating, from what I can read of what he publishes, a lot of it is anti-American. This is a publisher who led a boycott of American products, and yet the American pen is giving him an award for publishing, which kind of underlined to me that it's not ideological, it's the concept.
Absolutely. I mean, when we talk about defending freedom of the press or freedom of expression, it has to include all ideas and all concepts, whether they be favorable or unfavorable, or whether we like them or not. It's essential that we defend that right across the board, because no one knows when one's own rights are under threat. So it is, as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, the guarantee to seek, or it protects the right to seek, receive, and impart information of all ideas, and that includes opinions that we may or may not find tasteful. But the important thing is to defend the principle and the right to express one's views.
I think you are not particularly Turkmenistan, right?
I haven't a clue.
Okay, good. Then you're with me. We'll speak Turkmenistan to each other. Is there anything you wanted to say about Benchicou, about anything else that I haven't asked you a question for that you think would be a useful contribution?
I would just say, we hope that Mohammad Benchicou will be released immediately, and it's past due that he be released, and we hope that journalists not only in Algeria but all over the world can focus attention on his plight and give him back his freedom.
You've done good.
Thanks, Ann.
Thank you.
Just take my glasses off, actually. Okay.
Tell me, so that we spell it right, your name and your title and all that sort of stuff.
I'm Ann Beeson, and I'm the Associate Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union National Office.
Okay, Ann with an E? Beeson?
No E.
Okay.
Beeson, B-E-E-S-O-N.
I'm without an E as well. My mother's British, and she thinks the E version is the French version. I would never do that.
Interesting, I never heard that.
Okay. It's been bred in place with the available light. Okay.
I'll look washed out no matter what you do, but that's okay.
Is this the voice of experience?
Yes, very much so.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. I'd much rather look
I'll
washed
try.
out than have somebody forcibly put makeup on my face.
Yes, okay, I concur. You don't have to walk me through, and then this happened, and then it happened.
Mhm.
But it's essentially, broad brush, what is Sibel Edmonds' case about? Why is she getting this award, and what's it all about?
Mm-hmm. Boy, that is a broad question.
The way I describe it is, if you're at a cocktail party and you have
Mm-hmm.
to give a shorthand to somebody about what this is all about.
Sure. I'm trying to decide whether to start with the more personal side of the story or the political side of the story or whatever. Okay. Yeah. No, that's fine. Let me just think where to start. I think it'll actually be easier if I tell the personal side of the story first, which I will. I first met Sibel Edmonds at an event that Daniel Ellsberg, perhaps the most famous national security whistleblower, put on in Washington, D.C. And Dan kind of took me aside and said that, in fact, there was a real problem in today's climate in which the government was cracking down on and retaliating against numerous whistleblowers within agencies that work on national security. Now, at the ACLU, of course, our core priority has been to stem the backlash against civil rights in the name of national security ever since September 11th. But we had not yet identified this as a major concern until Dan Ellsberg told us about it. And he said that, in fact, Sibel Edmonds was one of the victims of this new policy of retaliation against whistleblowers. And I met Sibel, and she immediately kind of blew me away. She was very charismatic, very impressive, very articulate, told her story of what happened to her while she was a translator at the FBI in very simple and compelling terms, but didn't make the issue all about her. In fact, very quickly broadened her advocacy to help protect other whistleblowers. What happened to Sibel is actually pretty straightforward, and unfortunately is indicative of what's happening to other national security whistleblowers now. She went to work right after September 11th because she wanted to help the country, and she wanted to help, in fact, specifically help the government investigate who was responsible for these horrible attacks. And so she offered up her services as a translator to the FBI, and quickly went through a very rigorous, as you can imagine, security clearance to become a translator, a contract translator at the FBI. And she had been working there for a few months, and she discovered that there were very serious security breaches within the translation agency. And in fact, these translators were working on, for example, wiretaps that were directly related to the September 11th attacks. This is very important work that they were all doing. And she discovered, in fact, that there had been serious security breaches which could jeopardize the work and jeopardize the investigations. And also that, in fact, there was a potential that there was a person that she was just convinced was a spy from another country because of this person's close connections with the country for whom she was translating wiretaps. And she didn't think much of this. She did what most people, I think, with a strong character would do, and she reported these security breaches and this potential spy to her superiors at the FBI. And for that kind of, for exercising her patriotic duty, she was fired pretty quickly. Then she, of course, began to talk to members of Congress, began to talk to lawyers about the possibility of filing a lawsuit to highlight what happened to her and also to help other national security whistleblowers. And she filed this lawsuit, and almost every bit of this story is sort of hard to believe because it seems fairly straightforward what happened. Pretty clear from the record, from a legal point of view, that she was doing fine, she got great marks, her translations were fine, and then she reports these problems and she's immediately fired. So it's a pretty straightforward case. She was represented by other lawyers when she filed the case in the district court. And pretty soon after she filed this lawsuit, John Ashcroft himself, who was then the Attorney General, came in and filed an affidavit, which is a pretty intense thing to do in this lone woman's case, which said the case had to be thrown out of court because to let the case continue would jeopardize state secrets. And this is a doctrine that many lawyers like myself, who have been litigating for years, hardly ever see. It's an incredible, very, very rarely invoked privilege, and it can only be invoked by the Attorney General himself. So when she saw this, and when the lawyers saw this, they were they were shocked. They couldn't believe that the government was so afraid of what might come out in the course of this litigation that they would come and try to shut the whole thing down by having John Ashcroft himself file this affidavit. And then on top of that, they submitted secret evidence to the court in order to support this argument that the case needed to be thrown out. Sibel thought, oh, well, this is America, how can you rely on secret evidence? But the court accepted the evidence. Sibel thought, well, this is America, how could the court kick out my case just because John Ashcroft doesn't want it to go forward? Well, unfortunately, what happened was that the district court did throw out the case and did hold that the case couldn't continue because it would jeopardize state secrets. That was right about the time that I met Sibel, and she was desperate to find a new lawyer to appeal her case to the Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. And I couldn't believe what had happened so far, was amazed by it, and thought, absolutely, we'll come in and we'll help. And so at that point, we signed on to be her lawyers. Shortly after the judge had dismissed her case, the Inspector General of the Justice Department itself, the same Justice Department that Ashcroft was the head of, right, issued a report which confirmed everything, all of Sibel's story, basically. Confirmed that there had been serious security breaches within the translation agency, that there had been a potential spy within the agency that the FBI should have looked at much more closely, and even more importantly for her lawsuit, confirmed that the reason that the FBI fired her was because she had reported these wrongdoings. Now, from a lawyer's point of view, that should have been a slam dunk win. It should have been, okay, well, we'll go back into court. We'll say, look, the Justice Department itself now has written this report. It has this independent Inspector General. It says, and the Inspector General has concluded that her case is valid. We ought to be able to go back into court and get her a remedy. And unfortunately, even that wasn't enough. And that was really the posture, at which we had to kind of take it to the next level and go to the Court of Appeals, and the story gets more crazy, from then on. But what's ultimately, I think, so compelling about Sibel and her story is that she didn't make it just about her. She was concerned about fundamental principles of our democracy. She was born in another country which didn't have the protections we have here, and yet she stood up and she spoke out for these principles, and she wanted to make sure, even after it was clear that she wasn't going to be able to win her case, she continued to advocate, and she continues to this day to work with other whistleblowers to try to ensure that they don't get the same treatment that she did.
Yeah, because obviously it's a very long case. There's all sorts of stuff which no one's ever going to be able to see the evidence for, so it's hard to say, oh, she was clearly right, oh, she was clearly wrong, oh, it was somewhere in between. But even without knowing whether she was right or wrong, there's a lot you can know here.
Yeah, and as I said, what's remarkable about her case and the fact that she was unable to go forward with it because the court shut her down is that this isn't a case where we needed any more evidence. We didn't need any more evidence. The Justice Department itself, through its Inspector General, had already confirmed, in fact, that her allegations were true. And so there was simply no reason why any federal court should have decided that she was not entitled to move forward with her case and not entitled to receive some compensation for this retaliation. The Inspector General even went so far as to warn the FBI and to say that the FBI had to change its practices because, with retaliation, its retaliation, the FBI's retaliation against people like Sibel Edmonds was clearly going to have a chilling effect on other whistleblowers who might want to come forward and tell the public, tell Congress, that there are serious problems that could threaten our national security. That's the irony. I mean, Sibel Edmonds is not just a hero for the First Amendment and a hero in our democracy. I mean, Sibel Edmonds was trying to protect our nation's security. I mean, we talk a lot, and there are a lot of people that will talk about there being, some need for a trade-off between security and liberty. Well, that's a very false distinction in my view. And Sibel's case really illustrates that. I mean, Sibel was trying to make us free by enforcing our democratic principles of openness and of your First Amendment right to tell the truth, and she was trying to make us all safe by reporting these security breaches.
It is, as you say, remarkable that, and she's a naturalized citizen. Born in Iran, of all places that we would look at and say, well, we're much more free and open than they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, she has an amazing, personal story to tell about why she feels so strongly, and it has to do with her, her own father having been a whistleblower who was retaliated against in Turkey. It's an incredible story. Again, what was remarkable about the case at the point at which we were brought in is that we had a very strong case. We thought, oh, it was this trial court judge, he made a mistake. We'll get in front of the Court of Appeals and it'll get corrected. It's straightforward. We have this evidence now. The Inspector General has confirmed that her allegations of wrongdoing and of retaliation are true. And instead what happened is that, the day of the oral argument in the D.C. Circuit, we had notified many other members of her coalition of other national security whistleblowers, and there was a lot of media interest in the case. And we were expecting a full house in the court that day for the argument. And so many people had gathered on the courthouse steps to go in with me and with Sibel to be present during the oral argument. The night before the argument, we get a call from the clerk's office of the court telling us that the judges have decided to close the courtroom completely to the press and to all members of the public. And so we rushed around. We couldn't believe it. This is literally at 3 o'clock the day before the argument. And we miraculously, and this is shows what can happen when the ACLU collaborates with somebody like Sibel Edmonds, we got every major network news organization and every major newspaper to sign on to a brief asking the court to open the hearing back up so that they could all go. And sure enough, then the next day when we arrived, and there were many spectators around waiting to get in, we were allowed to come into the courtroom because there was an argument before Sibel's argument. And then the judges announced when that argument ended, they said, we've gotten this motion from the newspaper organizations, we're going to deny it, and the courtroom has to be cleared. And it was just like the next step in this. She just, Sibel couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. Nothing was normal about the way this case was proceeding. And we then had almost no time to, even in this closed session of the court, make our arguments. We were given about 10 or 15 minutes. Normally we would have had longer than that. And then even myself as her lawyer and Sibel were kicked out of the courtroom, and the government was allowed to make an argument to the Court of Appeals in secret. And so we were not so surprised when just a week or two after that, we got a ruling from the Court of Appeals, one-line order affirming the dismissal of Sibel's case. No discussion at all. And the question is, what in the world is the government really trying to cover up? It's phenomenal. I mean, whatever it is has convinced a lot of judges who you would think would know better to not let this woman's case go forward.
Well, that's a question in my mind. What if there is some great elephant that they can see in the room that we have not been able to see? I mean, even if there's a great reason that we can't understand, does that make it, if there was a great reason that we can't understand, would that make that the right decision?
I just can't fathom that there could be anything that would prevent her from winning her case in court. In other words, there may be secrets somehow surrounding the work that she was doing, etc., that none of us want to come, that we have no interest in even disclosing. But none of those facts are necessary for a court to determine whether or not the FBI fired her for speaking out. And again, it would be one thing if we didn't have any evidence, but what happened was that we got evidence from the horse's mouth. I mean, we had the Justice Department itself concluding in a public report that the FBI had fired her for speaking out. And if that fact is true, unless the Inspector General's, being duped too, there didn't seem to be any reason why her case couldn't continue. And I think the government somehow just managed to, I don't know what they told these judges, but to convince them that to create a lot of smoke and mirrors and suggest that some other facts, which might in fact need to be kept secret, might come out in the course of litigation. We just simply don't think that's the case. We had all the facts we needed. We didn't need to delve any further. They should have just offered. And frankly, the FBI ought to be willing to admit a mistake. I mean, especially after the Inspector General concluded that they had fired her inappropriately, they should have just come forward and offered to settle the case, and they didn't do that. They dug their heels in.
Some have made an ironic statement about the fact that it was the day that when she went to the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court denied to hear her case, the day that the big crack appeared on the marble and it fell down and...
I haven't heard that story.
Oh, yeah.